One. I also shared the link to the slides in the chat. They're online. They will also stay online. So no need to take notes or take screenshots. You can always go back to the slides. My talk today will be about hierarchy and abuse of power, challenges in the scientific work environment. Before I dive in, I want to briefly tell you why I'm actually here talking about abuse of power. So, what about my trajectory as an academic brought me to care about this topic? It all started in 2015 when I started my PhD at the Max Planck Institute for Dynamics and Self-Organization in Göttingen. And during the time of my PhD from 2015 to 2018, I was a PhD representative at my institute. And in 2018, I was the spokesperson of the Max Planck PhD Net, representing the about 4,500 doctoral researchers in the Max Planck Society. And during this time, particularly in 2018, there were two very high-profile cases of power abuse in the Max Planck Society, one at an institute in Garching and one in Leipzig. And those two cases got a lot of media attention. And through this media attention, lots of doctoral researchers in the Max Planck Society kind of recognized themselves in these cases, even though they weren't part of these particular cases. And they came to me as the representative of the PhDs in the Max Planck Society, describing their situations to me. So I ended up having many conversations with victims of power abuse, and I started to see systemic issues in the academic system that lead to these difficult conflict situations, lead to situations where power is abused. And I started thinking about what we can change in the academic system to prevent these cases from happening in such a regularity. And even after I finished my PhD, the topic stayed with me. I am now somewhat convinced that power abuse is actually threatening the integrity of science at its core because it puts people in situations where they have to oftentimes decide between their own mental or physical health or that of their family and preserving scientific integrity. So to me, it became a very important topic to work on and address to make sure that we can do the best science we can. So I took this impetus forward, and in 2021, I was part of a group of people that founded the Network Against the Abuse of Power in Science, where I'm currently also a member. And the aim of this network is to, first of all, counsel and advise people that are in difficult situations, but then also to raise awareness about the issue. And, for example, give talks like the one I'm giving today to talk about what power abuse in science is and what we can do about it. And this also brings me about the agenda for the talk today. As was already mentioned, it will take about 60 minutes. I will start with showing you a few cases of what I call power abuse in the wild. These are descriptions of cases that actually happened in a similar way and were described to me, just to tell you what exactly it is we're talking about. I will then try to systematize this a little bit, going away from anecdotes to facts and figures, and also trying to tie the cases of power abuse we see to these systemic problems in the academic system. I will then move on to talk about the existing mechanisms for conflict resolutions in academia, particularly in Germany, and why they currently don't really work adequately, why a network such as the Network Against Power Abuse is necessary. I will then dip a little bit into what I think are the serious consequences of ongoing abuse situations, mental health, threats to scientific integrity and also hiring problems. I'm aware that there can be said much more about each of these topics. I will just touch them on the surface. And then I will end my talk with suggestions for potential solutions. So what can we do to prevent and deal with power abuse, ranging from the systemic level over the institutional level to the individual level. So let's dive in and talk about power abuse in the wild. So the following cases, 4 cases, have been described to me by the victims. Of course, this is a victim-centered description. I did not talk to the other side. I've changed a few details, so nobody is recognizable in the case descriptions anymore. But overall, this is what has been described to me. And I'm structuring each of these 4 cases in a short description of the situation, what the actual conflict of interest was, what was done, and whether there was help being sought in this case. So the first case deals with extortion of labor, something we sadly see quite often. We have a situation where after 4 years, a doctoral researcher has enough publications for a cumulative thesis according to the rules of their university. So they would like to finish their PhD, but their PI wants another publication and prevents the PhD from finishing. So here we have a conflict of interest. As a consequence, the finishing of the PhD degree is delayed. Eventually, the working contract of the doctoral researcher expires, and the doctoral researcher keeps working on unemployment money. In the end, the PhD is finished, but the PI declines to write a letter of recommendation because of this falling out over the finishing of the PhD. The doctoral researcher actually does contact the ombudsperson of their institution. We will talk about ombudsperson as potential contact points a bit later as well. But this ombudsperson does not intervene because they do not feel responsible for the situation, as it is not, in their perspective, a clear case of scientific misconduct. The outcome is that the doctoral researcher does receive the degree in the end, but their academic career is over and they leave academia for a job in industry, which is not a bad outcome per se. I want to stress that. But in this case, the person actually did intend to stay in academia, but could not because they could not find an adequate postdoc position because of this lacking letter of recommendation. In the second case, we are talking about neglect. So in this situation, we have an international postdoc with a very short working contract, but an extension of the work contract is promised. And we have a situation where the PI and the lab assistant are a married couple. This is a wet lab, so the lab assistant has a quite crucial role to make sure that all the experiments are working. A conflict of interest arises because the postdoc wants to take an extended vacation. They've been pooling vacation time to visit their family abroad, but the PI wants the work to be done quickly and declines to give a long vacation time. As a consequence of this falling out, the lab assistant stops supporting the postdoc in the lab. And because of the lack of support and also materials to conduct experiments, there are no good results out of the work of the postdoc in the lab. And because of the bad results, the work contract is not extended. The staff council or ombudsperson, which could both provide help in the situation, are not contacted. The postdoc coming from abroad simply doesn't know that they exist or would be responsible in the situation. And in the end, the postdoc ends up experiencing a great deal of frustration and pressure, wastes time working in an inadequate environment, and ultimately leaves the country. In the third case, we have a situation which is mainly characterized by very high psychological pressure on the early career researchers. Here, we have a large time-critical project where the PI themselves is under a lot of pressure to produce good results. We have a postdoc that gets pregnant, works in that project, and the preliminary results that this postdoc has obtained do not support the hypothesis of the PI. A conflict of interest arises because the postdoc wants to go on maternal leave, but the PI wants positive results before that happens. As a consequence, the PI applies enormous psychological pressure, demanding overwork before the maternal leave and also demanding that the leave is kept to a minimum. The PI also asks the postdoc to not deliver negative results. The Equal Opportunities Officer in this case could be responsible, but is not informed because the postdoc fears that if they report this case, this will somehow get to the PI and the PI will retaliate against the postdoc. And as an outcome, there are mental and physical health issues for the postdoc, which can be tied to the situation of enormous pressure. And the integrity of science is threatened as there is this enormous pressure to produce positive results. And in the last case, we have a case that is pretty clearly leading to bad scientific practice. We have a situation where there's a very famous PI that employs many doctoral researchers on very risky projects with very short contract durations. An international doctoral researcher joins this project and they bring a young family from abroad with them. And they're the primary provider for this family. Contract extensions in this project are again tied to positive results. And the doctoral researchers being from a non-European country, their visa is tied to the work contract. As a consequence, the doctoral researcher feels enormous pressure to produce good results. They work 70 hours a week. They don't take any vacation. They work weekends and long nights. They don't inform anybody about this unsustainable situation with this very high pressure and the demand to produce short-term good results. They fear that anybody who they could inform, for example, the ombudsperson, will not be able to help them in an adequate way because in this case, the ombudsperson themselves is dependent on the PI and working on a short-term contract, and therefore the doctoral researcher does not trust them. The outcome of the situation is that there is sloppy science performed under immense psychological pressure and a situation that might even border on the manufacturing of data just to relieve this immense pressure and get the next contract extension to be able to provide for their family. Well, with these 4 cases, I tried to illustrate situations that have and still do happen in academia in Germany. And building on these cases, I'll try to find kind of a definition of power abuse. And before I do that, I want to stress that having and using power in itself is not a bad thing. It is necessary to effectively lead an organization. However, when power is used, there needs to be a reflection on the consequences of using said power for the person using the power and also for the people that are affected by the use of power. And the more the person using the power is acting for their own benefit while damaging other people that are affected by the use of power in an illegitimate way, the more we are talking about an abuse of power. And what I try to instill here is that this is a spectrum. So there are very clear cases where everybody would say, yes, this is power abuse. There are cases where people might disagree, and there are legitimate cases of use of power with which people might not be happy, but which are not illegitimate per se. And the tricky thing about abuse of power, especially in academia in Germany and German-speaking countries in general, is that such behavior that might be clearly unethical and recognized as such by anybody that it is described to can be legal, and it can even be in the interest of academic institutions if it produces flashy results. Now, when I describe these cases, sometimes criticism arises and people say, well, but this is singular cases. This is individual bad apples, bad PIs, and this is not a systemic problem. And in the following slides, I want to show you facts and figures and hopefully convince you otherwise, namely that this is not singular cases, this is actually a pretty prevalent phenomenon. And thankfully, there are first larger scale studies emerging that try to put numbers to how often do these cases of power abuse or conflict situations at work that have an abusive character arise. And what I show you here is figures from the German Association for Psychology, DGPS, who asked their members how often they experience harassment at work. And they define harassment as regular behavior that creates an intimidating, hostile, socially isolating, discriminating, or offensive working environment, which are often the behaviors with which such a illegal use of power is informed. And what they show, so they asked the respondents how often they witness such behavior and how often they experience such behavior. And they see that between 20 and 25% say that they often or regularly witness or experience such behavior. And over 50% at least sometimes report that they at least sometimes witness or experience such behavior. They then also asked whether the respondents perceived this behavior as contingent on hierarchy. And here the large majority of respondents said that they either mostly or completely perceived such harassment as contingent on hierarchy in the work environment. We have similar numbers from the Max Planck Society. This is a study among doctoral researchers that was conducted in 2020. I was part of this study. And the numbers are also corroborated by an independent study that was conducted by Professor Schrautner in 2019. And here we asked the doctoral researchers of the Max Planck Society, while working at your institute, have you ever been subjected to harassment by a superior? And we split the responses into different demographic characteristics. We see that overall about 13% say yes. The numbers are higher in different scientific fields. So here we differentiate between the biomedical section. This is the slight pink bar where the number is highest. The number is lowest in the chemistry, physics, and technology section, about 10%, and in the middle in the humanities section. We also differentiate by gender. We see that people identifying as female or as neither female or male report the highest numbers. And then we also differentiate by nationality. We differentiate by German nationality, which has the lowest number, citizens within the European Union, and citizens outside the European Union, which have the highest number with 16%. And then there is a last data point that I want to show you, which is an international survey conducted by Nature Careers in 2020, which asked for experiences of harassment and discrimination by postdocs. And here, a whopping 2/3 report that they have experienced power imbalances / bullying in the workplace. The number is that high, I think, because power imbalances are a very, very general and vague way, and not every power imbalance needs to be abusive per se. But the number, nevertheless, is pretty concerning. And the second number that I also want to point out here is the 40% report that they have experienced gender-based discrimination in the workplace is also really concerning. So why do we see these relatively high numbers? Why do we see between 15% and up to 2/3 of postdocs reporting that they experience harassment in the workplace, abusive behavior, power imbalances / bullying? And I think that this is the case because there are just many opportunities in the academic work environment that can be abused. There are many power differentials in academia, particularly in German academia. And here I want to systematize this a little bit. So the first power differential that early career researchers have with their superiors is around the contract situation. So oftentimes PIs single-handedly decide about contract durations and extensions. And for people from non-EU countries, the situation is even more difficult because their visa directly depend on the work contract. The second power differential emerges around assessment of the work. So in Germany, and oftentimes also in Austria and Switzerland, for doctoral researchers, PIs are responsible both for the supervision of the daily work as well as for the assessment of the PhD project in the end, which creates this double dependency in the day-to-day work. The third power differential emerges around reputation. So reputation is the foundation of an academic career. With a bad reputation, you'll likely go nowhere. And reputation is codified in the letter of recommendation that a PI should write if somebody leaves the lab to go on and start a new position somewhere else. And in addition, it's relatively easy for PIs to boost or diminish the reputation of one of their early career researchers if they want to. And then lastly, a fourth power differential that I think is oftentimes overlooked is the one around institutional knowledge. So in German academia, the fluctuation of non-tenured researchers is extremely high, and it is systemically intended. So people are systemically intended to leave the place where they did their PhD to do a postdoc somewhere else for 2 years and then go to another institution and another institution. As a result, these early career researchers often know much less about the institution they're currently at and about their rights than their respective superiors who've on average been at the institution for much longer and have much better institutional knowledge and also a much better local network. And this creates a systemic disadvantage in the ability of people that are affected by abusive situations to seek out help for themselves and to insist on their rights as employees at an institution. So as a result of these multiple power differentials, people report that they experience academia not only as enabling unethical behavior, but actively encouraging and incentivizing it via the incentive structures that are laid out. In addition, the discovery of abusive behavior is very unlikely because of missing compliance mechanisms, of conflicts of interest, of existing mechanisms, and of a fear of reporting actual unethical behavior. The punishment of abusive behavior is even more unlikely due to missing incentives for institutions to act on reports of unethical behavior. And lastly, there is evidence emerging that people that are predisposed towards abusing their power are drawn to leadership positions in academia and are even more likely to make it to powerful positions in academia. So at this point, oftentimes the question arises, okay, so the system is pretty fertile grounds for abusive behavior, but is it really only the superiors who are the perpetrators? Thankfully, the German Association for Psychology also asked about that. And they asked people how often colleagues at the same level, senior colleagues, junior colleagues, students, or supervisors were the perpetrators in the situations where harassment at work was witnessed or experienced. And here about 2/3 of the people that had witnessed or experienced harassment at work report that the perpetrators were either senior colleagues or superiors. That means that there is a non-negligible amount of cases that emerges from abuse by colleagues on the same level or even by students. But it is safe to say that the majority of cases does have superiors or senior colleagues as perpetrators. Why? why is this the case? So I already hinted at this a little bit in the previous slide. How do we currently select leaders for academic positions? How do we select professors, leaders of institutions, directors of institutes? First of all, personal integrity is a stable trait that varies across people. The willingness to compromise personal integrity and exploit others can be advantageous in a scientific career if the incentives are as they are, namely that you will make it far if you produce many papers and get a lot of third-party funding and care less about the well-being of the people that work under you. And sadly, currently, we still almost exclusively select academic leaders based on this excellence in research that we tend to measure via counting the number of publications and the number of third-party funding euros that they receive. And taken together, this means that people that are predisposed towards abusing their power and compromising on their personal integrity are drawn to academia and are more likely to make it to powerful positions. That means that not only do we give people ample opportunity to abuse their power via the steep power differentials and the missing compliance mechanism, but we also recruit people on average that are more likely to compromise on their own personal integrity and abuse people that work under them. So to summarize this facts and figure part of my talk, I hope I have shown you convincing evidence that power abuse in academia is not limited to singular cases. It's about 15 to 20% of academics that are affected by harassment at work. The academic system systematically fosters the abuse of power by the way it is set up with its many power differentials. And the mechanisms that select leaders do favor people that are predisposed to abuse of power. Now, in the next part of my talk, I want to dive a bit into the existing mechanisms that are meant to be in place to resolve conflicts in the academic system right now. Which mechanisms are there and how well do they work? The first mechanism that is there and meant to step in such abusive situations is the ombud system. So the rules of the German Science Foundation, the DFG, Rules for Good Scientific Practice, lay out the responsibility of the heads of research work units to take responsibility for the development of the early career researchers and to prevent such abusive situations. So to just read out to you what these rules of good scientific practice that every research institution in Germany that wants to receive funding by this body, which is almost every research institution, are tied to. So the rules state that the leadership role includes ensuring adequate individual supervision of early career researchers integrated in the overall institutional policy, as well as career development for researchers and research support staff. Suitable organizational measures are in place at the level of the individual unit and of the leadership of the institution to prevent the abuse of power and exploitation of dependent relationships. And by virtue of being part of the rules of good scientific practice, the ombud people of scientific institutions are responsible to step in cases of power abuse, where power abuse is reported to them. Every research institution has to have an ombud person, and these ombud persons are bound to confidentiality. So if something is reported to them and the person reporting does not want this to come out, the ombud person is bound to keep it confidential, and they're responsible for handling such reports. Another system that is in place that can help in conflict situations are staff councils. So in Germany, every workplace with at least 5 employees is entitled to have a staff council. In German, staff council is Betriebsrat or Personalrat. Staff councils are elected by their employees from employees every 4 years. They do represent the interests of staff within the scope of the employment relationship and workplace. So just to give you a few examples where a staff council could be the right place to go to. If, for example, a superior forces you to work without having an active employment contract, if your contract has a shorter duration than your degree program, which should not be the case under German labor law that lays out the conditions for how and how long contracts can be time limited in academia, or if your workplace is not safe or adequately equipped for you to work there. And members of the staff council are also bound to confidentiality, as are the ombudspeople. Another point of contact or system in place to help are equal opportunity and diversity units. Now, every workplace with at least 100 employees has to have an equal opportunity officer, Gleichstellungsbeauftragte in German, and they are elected from all female employees. By law, these equal opportunity officers are only concerned with women's rights, but some offices extend their responsibility to other dimensions of diversity and discrimination, such as culture, religion, ethical background, and so on. Examples where equal opportunity officers can help are, for example, if a superior threatens to fire you because you're pregnant, if you're being discriminated against because you're nursing your child at work, or if you're passed over for a promotion because you're a woman. And again, equal opportunities officers are bound to confidentiality. Then many research institutions, including the KIT, do have established conflict management units now. And these are sometimes set up as a kind of one-stop shop where you can come with any conflict you're experiencing, and they will connect you to other units like the equal opportunities officers, staff councils, or ombudspeople, if helpful in this case. They are in general concerned with moderating and mediating conflicts, and cases where such a conflict management unit could be helpful are when you're experiencing a conflict at work and you're in general unsure how to deal with it and what the next step could be. Or, for example, when you need a third party to mediate a difficult meeting with your superior. Conflict management units are only bound to confidentiality if they operate according to mediation law. If they do not, and they need to state this, then they're not per se bound to confidentiality. And then, a bit depending on the context and the institution, there are a few other possibilities where you could get help. There are graduate school coordinators, which are oftentimes great resources to find ways out of a conflict. There is your superior's superior. So even PIs do have superiors, like deans, directors, or university presidents, that can sometimes be helpful in resolving conflicts. These people in general can provide useful advice, but are not bound to confidentiality. So if you talk to these people, be sure that you are fine with whatever you tell them, also leaving the room. And then there is the Network Against Abuse of Power in Science, which I am part of, which tries to offer institution-independent counseling for victims of power abuse. We do not provide legal or psychological advice, but we have seen many different conflict situations and have accumulated quite a bit of knowledge about the academic system, and are sometimes able to provide new perspectives on possible solutions. So to just summarize this for the KIT specifically, and as I said, my slides are online and accessible to you. Here are the contacts for these specific conflict resolution mechanisms that are in place at KIT. Ombudspeople, the staff councils in Karlsruhe and Garmisch-Partenkirchen, conflict management units, the general one, and also the one that is specifically hosted at the House of Young Scientists, and the Equal Opportunities and Diversity Unit. So There are many possibilities to help in conflict situations, as I've just shown you. But do people actually use them? Do they actually report misconduct? And sadly, the numbers that are emerging through various surveys say not really. So the German Association for Psychologists, again, that I'm drawing on a lot here, have asked their respondents whether they have ever reported misconduct that they have experienced or witnessed. And they asked this for both scientific practice, the top two bars, and harassment at work. And for both cases, only a small minority of people say that they have actually reported bad scientific practice or harassment at work. So for bad scientific practice, it's around 10%. And for harassment at work, it's a bit over 20% of cases that have actually been reported. In the same survey, they also asked for the people that did report how they felt, or if they felt supported by the institution to which they reported the misconduct. And now here the numbers are getting fairly small because so few cases are actually reported, but they are still indicative of what tends to happen after such a report. So only a very, very small minority of people say that they felt either mostly or totally supported by their institution after reporting such a case of misconduct. And the large majority said that they felt not at all or only a bit supported by their institution. They were then also asked what happened after the report and whether people were satisfied with the results of the report. And here, for bad scientific practice, 0 people said that they were totally satisfied with the result of the report. For harassment at work, it's 1 person for witnessed harassment and 3 persons for experienced. And only a small minority that reports that they were mostly satisfied with the report, with the results of the report. The overwhelming majority says that they were not at all or only a bit satisfied with the results of the report. We asked a pretty similar question in our survey in the Max Planck Society. So first of all, we asked people whether they're actually aware of the rules of good scientific practice of the Max Planck Society. And here about 50% of the people say that, yes, they are aware and they know them quite well, which is not so bad. But the 40% that say that they're in general aware that these rules exist, but not really what they say, are a bit concerning. We then also asked them whether they know a person that they can report to in case of severe misconduct, and about 2/3 say yes. So this already points in the direction that actually these points of contact are not well known. But then we asked them if they ever reported misconduct. About 5% said yes. And of those 5%, we asked them what the result was. And there we see pretty similar numbers to the survey from the German Association of Psychology. About 40% say that the problem was resolved without negative consequences for reporting. But 30% say that nothing happened after the report, which is not a good outcome, not very satisfying. And 13% say that the problem was resolved, but they suffered negative consequences themselves for reporting. And this is, of course, pretty unsettling because if you have such a non-vanishing chance of retaliation, of suffering negative consequences if you report misconduct, that, of course, makes you think about whether you actually want to report something. So to summarize, very, very few cases are reported. Only about 20 to 25% of experienced or witnessed harassment cases, and only about 10 to 15% of scientific misconduct are reported. Why is this the case? Well, I believe because there is a significant chance of facing negative consequences for the reporting person. And the people that do report misconduct are experiencing lacking institutional support. If they do report something, the satisfaction with the outcome is very low. Only about 10 to 20% say that they're mostly or completely satisfied with the outcome. And what we also see, and this is not from the surveys I just showed you, this is more from our counseling meetings with people that come to the Network Against Power Abuse and report their cases to us, is that we see a diffusion of responsibilities between the different mechanisms that would be responsible for dealing with reports that frequently lead to inaction of individual officers. And we also see that people are not aware of the available options or are very unsure where to go, and then they go nowhere. What we also see is that especially in smaller research institutions, and when these officers in the various mechanisms are elected, that they tend to be overwhelmed if cases become very complicated. And these cases oftentimes are very complicated and messy due to a lack of professionalization. So if it's an elected office and not somebody doing this full time and being a professional, it's very hard to bring the necessary skills to actually deal with these reports in a professional way. And we also see a lack of independence. So a lack of these offices having the right amount of power to actually do something in the case when something is reported, or even cases where people that are responsible for investigating and settling these reports are in a dependent employment position themselves. I want to change gear a bit now and move away from the reporting mechanisms. I will revisit this, what can we actually do, in the last bit of my talk. But before I do that, I want to talk a bit about what are the serious consequences of such abusive situations and why we should actually care about resolving them. First of all, what has been shown in many, many studies now is that the mental health of people, early career researchers working in academia, is not in a good state. We've seen this in the survey we conducted among doctoral researchers in the Max Planck Society, that about half of the doctoral researchers report symptoms that are consistent with a high anxiety disorder. So here we used clinical questionnaires to ask about symptoms of depression and anxiety, and about 50% of the respondents report symptoms consistent with high anxiety. For depression, the numbers are smaller, but still very concerning. We see that about 16-17% report symptoms that are consistent with a moderate to severe depressive disorder. And these numbers are also consistent with a meta-study that came out in 2021 that combined results from many surveys about mental health in academia that showed that the prevalence of anxiety and depression among doctoral researchers is about twice as high as in a comparable non-academic cohort. So people that do have the same degree, but do not work in academia. In the survey in the Max Planck Society, we then continued to ask people how satisfied they are with the supervision situation. And while this is only correlational evidence, we think that is quite indicative of a tie between supervision working well or not well and people having symptoms of depression or anxiety. So to the left, we see the prevalence of symptoms of anxiety stratified by the satisfaction level with the supervision. So the people in the very left bar here are people that report that they are very satisfied with the supervision situation. And of those people, only 30% show symptoms of high anxiety. This is still an extremely concerning number. I don't want to keep that or diminish that. But what we see when we look at the other satisfaction levels with supervision is the people that report that they are very dissatisfied with their supervision, already 2/3 report symptoms that are consistent with an anxiety disorder. For depression, we see a very, very similar trend. We see that people that are very satisfied with the supervision situation also report much lower symptoms of depression. And when we go through the satisfaction levels towards the people that are very dissatisfied with the supervision situation, we see a much higher prevalence of depressive symptoms. We also looked at the connection between experiences of bullying and harassment and their connection to mental health issues. So we asked people, while working at your institute, have you at any point been subjected to bullying by a superior? And we see that people that report that they've never been subjected to bullying, only, in quotes, still a number that is much too high, only about 50% report high symptoms of anxiety. Whereas if we go to people that report that they are subject to bullying by a superior monthly or weekly, there are almost no people left that do not have an anxiety disorder. And we see the same trend for people that have been subjected to unwanted behavior by a superior that could be characterized as sexual harassment. These numbers that come from our own survey in the Max Planck Society are corroborated by a study that came out last year in Sweden. What they did there is they looked at the prevalence of prescriptions of psychiatric drugs during the PhD. Now, these are only prescriptions. It doesn't tell you whether the people actually picked up the drugs, but they're still pretty indicative. And they related that to the years relative to the PhD start. And we can see that when people start their PhD, the number of prescriptions of psychiatric drugs rises steeply until about 4 or 5 years into the PhD, and then drops off again as people finish their PhD. And by doing a pretty clever matching approach of the PhD cohort to the non-PhD cohort, these researchers managed to establish a causal link between doing a doctorate and an increased likelihood of suffering from depression or an anxiety disorder. I think that many factors correlate with mental health. We also see this in our survey. So we correlated different factors of the academic work environment with symptoms of depression. In this case, anxiety looks the same. But what we see is that the factors that can be tied to the relationship with the supervisor, with the superior, are the ones that most strongly correlate with symptoms of anxiety and depression. So workload, work environment and atmosphere, and supervision are among the highest correlates with mental health in academia. This study by Nature Careers that I already showed you a bit earlier in the talk went on to ask their postdocs whether they have ever considered leaving academia because of depression, anxiety, or similar issues related to their work. And 50% of the postdocs said yes. Their deteriorating mental health, they have considered it as a reason of leaving academia. And this brings me to the next serious consequence, which is an increasing lack of people that do want to keep working in academia, which is now also already noticed by the PIs that started complaining that there are no postdocs to be found anymore. So in 2022, at almost the same time, both Nature and Science had opinion pieces that complained about the lack of postdocs. And I do believe that the lack of postdocs increasingly has to do with these precarious and unhealthy working conditions in academia that are strongly tied to bad supervision situations. In addition to being tied to bad supervision situations, they are also tied to bad scientific practice. Now here the link is a bit less clear, at least in my opinion, than the tie to bad mental health. So in the Max Planck Society, we asked people whether they were involved in or observed several kinds of bad scientific practice, starting with things that are clear violations of scientific integrity, like duplicate publications or plagiarism or data manipulation, and leading up to things like honorary authorship, conflicts of authorship in general, and sloppy scientific work. And we see that these categories of honorary authorship, other conflicts of authorship, and sloppy work do actually happen quite frequently. So about 17 to 23% say that they have either been involved in or witnessed such things happening. And from our counseling sessions with people that are affected by conflict situations, we see that this is often an outcome or a cause of such a conflict situation, that there is sloppy work being conducted, that there are conflicts of authorship that are at the heart of such a conflict situation, or that superiors demand to become honorary authors of work that they actually did not contribute to. The study just supplements this. The study from the German Association of Psychology reports pretty similar numbers of bad scientific practice being witnessed and experienced at work. And this is just to show you that, again, here we're not talking about singular cases. We're actually talking about a pretty frequent and systemic thing that happens in academia. So to summarize this bit, before I go into the last bit of my talk, I've shown you that mental health issues are rampant among academics, and that there are many indicators that show that a bad relationship between superiors and early career researchers plays an important role for mental health issues. The working conditions in academia are such that they increasingly cause people to consider leaving academia, and bad scientific practice, especially when it comes to conflicts of authorship and sloppy work, do emerge in the context of the abuse of power. So after painting this relatively grim picture of the current situation, what can we do? In the very beginning, I showed you that I think the root cause of these very prevalent abusive situations is the existence of these multiple power differentials in academia. So if power differentials are reduced, the opportunities to abuse them will be less frequent. How can we reduce power differentials? As already said, power in itself is not a problem. It only becomes a problem when it becomes concentrated in a single person that uses it for their own gain in an illegitimate way while damaging the people that are affected by the use of power. How can we break up these multiple dependencies with a single person having all the power? Well, we could separate supervision of doctoral theses and the assessment of the dissertation in the end. This is standard in many countries. Sadly, in Germany, it is not. In addition, doctoral researchers should be supervised by thesis committees that include people that are independent of the primary supervisor and can step in the case where there is a conflict. And the duration of working contracts should be equal to the duration of the PhD degree. And after the PhD degree, positions should be tenured as the rule rather than the exception. Because we see that especially these situations around contract extensions, short contracts, very often are the friction points where these abusive situations arise, because the person that needs the contract extension is in such a vulnerable situation, and the person on the other side that does the contract extension is in such a powerful situation to extort almost anything they want from the early career researcher. What else can we do? Of course, victims of power abuse should be supported adequately. I've shown you with the facts and figures that currently, sadly, they're mostly left to fend for themselves, and there can be done a lot from the institutional side to better support victims of power abuse. Institutional emergency mechanisms need to be specified and then also communicated widely, So people need to know what they should do if they ever find themselves in such an abusive situation. There need to be mechanisms to change supervisor. This needs to be thought about before something actually happens, and then also communicated transparently to affected people. How do you actually change your supervisor without completely fucking up your academic career? This needs to include thinking about access to data and devices that are required to complete a project, as well as how authorship is handled in case the relationship to the supervisor breaks down. And then institutions need to provide independent and free counseling and also legal advice to people that are affected by such situations. I think there can be a lot said about professionalizing processes. So what we see is that contact points that are responsible for handling cases of power abuse, while oftentimes being extremely motivated and kind and helpful people, are oftentimes not in good positions to actually do something when they receive reports. Sometimes they don't feel responsible, but oftentimes they simply lack resources or they lack power themselves to act effectively. So any contact points that are responsible for resolving or investigating conflict cases need to be easy to reach, and they need to be able to act independently. I think a best practice is actually establishing such a one-stop shop that cooperates with the other existing mechanisms, because it's much easier to communicate and to act as a kind of guide through the system for people that are affected by conflict situations. Steps in reporting processes need to be communicated transparently towards the affected people, and binding deadlines for individual actions need to be established and followed to prevent this diffusion of responsibility that oftentimes simply leads to a fizzling out of the report and inaction on the side of the institution. And this all needs to be accompanied by documentation and quality control processes for the contact points themselves that ensure that a certain level of professionalism is maintained. I've talked a bit about leaders in academia and why they're currently not in a very good place, because the incentive structures are set out in a way that they incentivize unethical leadership. So demanding good leadership could also contribute to preventing power abuse in the first place. That includes assessment criteria beyond papers and grants that need to be established for recruitment and promotion processes. It requires establishing a robust feedback culture, including exit interviews that allows both leaders and institutions to learn. Because also speaking from the position of a professor, we are trained to be excellent academics and do good research, but we are not trained to be good leaders. But good leadership can be learned. But it requires training, and I think leadership trainings should be mandatory for academic leaders, because this is a major part of the role of a professor. It's not sitting in a lab doing lab work anymore. It is providing good leadership for the research team. And in case of bad leadership, serious consequences need to be imposed, ranging from additional training to the prohibition of supervision of early career researchers in the first place. And then I want to end with a slide that lays out measures for self-help. So what I've told you in the slides before, these are all measures that happen on the institutional or system level. But what can you do when you yourself find yourself in a situation, in an abusive situation? So the very first step is to recognize that you are in a very extreme situation that threatens your mental and physical health. It is okay to ask for help. Make sure that you are in a safe and stable situation yourself as the very first step. Then secure any evidence you can get your hand on. Make sure you have timely, detailed, and written documentation of your experiences, and ask witnesses to join difficult meetings if you have to take them. Know your rights. as an employee and as an academic. This includes knowing about employment law, about sexual self-determination, about whistleblower protection, potentially copyright law might be relevant, general equal treatment law if the case involves discrimination. It is also extremely helpful to get legal insurance before anything happens, because when something already happened, no legal insurer will take you on anymore. And as a tip, being part of a union does give you legal insurance for cases related to employment law and employment rights. Seek information about available internal resources. So I did say a lot about the inadequacy of internal mechanisms, but they can also be helpful, especially if you find the right mechanism and a good person working there, and they do exist. Find out about the ombudsperson of your institute, find out about equal opportunities officers, staff council, mediation opportunities, psychological counseling, and make use of these internal resources if you feel you can trust them and they are helpful. Act strategically. Reflect on your dependencies. For example, when does your contract end? What steps do you need to do to complete your PhD thesis? And develop a strategy to deal with these dependencies before you do a report and you start the process. And lastly, try to connect to other victims. It is very likely that you're not alone with your experiences. And speaking now from the experience of somebody who's seen a lot of these cases and how they played out, joint action with other people that are affected in the same situation, in the same research group with the same perpetrator, joint action increases the chance that the institution will act tremendously. And with that, I'm at the end of my talk. As I said, my slides are online. This QR code also leads you to them, and I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jana, for giving us this